She woke up at 5 in the morning. Not because anyone asked her to, not because an alarm went off, but because in that house, if she wasn't the first one up, she would hear about it all day long. The kitchen light flickered on, and there she stood, a 31-year-old woman with a graduate degree, her hands submerged in dishwater that had gone cold from the night before. The house was already stirring. A chair scraped across the tile. Someone cleared their throat from the hallway. And then came the sigh, long, slow, deliberate, from her mother-in-law, who had walked in, looked at the half-set table, and turned back around without saying a single word. She didn't need to. The silence said everything. And in that moment, standing there in a house she helped pay for, in a life she helped build, one thought passed through her mind quietly, like something she had been too afraid to say out loud for years. I live here, but I have never once felt like I belong here. Before we continue, tell me where you are listening from today. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story is traveling. And can I ask you something personal? How old are you? I genuinely want to know who I'm sharing these stories with. Just a gentle note. Parts of this story include fictionalized elements for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real names or places is coincidental, but the message behind it is very real, and I hope it stays with you. Her name was Rachel Monroe. And if you had met her 5 years before this morning, you would not have recognized the woman standing at that kitchen sink. 5 years before this, Rachel was sharp, confident, and building something real. She had graduated with honors from a state university in Georgia with a degree in business administration. She had worked 2 years at a mid-sized marketing firm in Atlanta before she met Daniel. Daniel Monroe was the kind of man who made you feel seen. He was steady, soft-spoken, and when he looked at Rachel across a crowded restaurant during their first date, he made her feel like the only person in the room. They dated for 2 years. They got engaged on a Tuesday evening in November, standing on the back porch of Daniel's childhood home in suburban Ohio. And Rachel, who had built walls most of her adult life, let every single one of them down. She was 39 days away from a promotion at her firm when she said yes. She would never go back to that job, not because Daniel asked her to leave, but because what came after the wedding was something no one had prepared her for. Daniel's family was the kind of family that had opinions about everything. His mother, Carol, was a retired school administrator who ran her household the same way she had once run her classrooms, with authority, expectation, and very little patience for anything she hadn't approved of first. His sister, Melissa, was 2 years younger than Daniel, unmarried, employed full-time as a dental hygienist, and never once let Rachel forget either of those last two facts. And his father, Gerald, was a quiet man, but not gentle quiet. More like a man who let the women in his family do the talking while he sat back and nodded in agreement. From the very first Thanksgiving after the wedding, Rachel felt it. It wasn't one big moment. It was the way Carol reached past her to fix the centerpiece she had just arranged. It was the way Melissa laughed just a little too long when Rachel mispronounced a street name in their town. It was small. It was consistent. And it was absolutely intentional. Ask yourself something right now. Have you ever walked into a room full of people and felt invisible? Not because you were quiet, but because someone else had decided your presence didn't matter? That is the kind of invisible Rachel became inside that family. Within the first 6 months of marriage, she and Daniel had moved into a home of their own, a 3-bedroom house in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. It was a good home, a real home. But Carol lived 20 minutes away, and she drove those 20 minutes at least 4 times a week. She would walk in, look around, and find something. There was always something. The dishes were stacked wrong. The curtains let in too much morning light. The way Rachel made Daniel's coffee was not the way Daniel liked his coffee, or at least, that was what Carol said. And Daniel, every single time, would smile politely and say nothing. Rachel would look at him from across the room, waiting. He would look at his phone. Now here is what most people watching this do not yet know. And this is important, because the story of Rachel Monroe is not simply a story about a difficult mother-in-law. It is not just a story about a passive husband. It is the story of what happens when an intelligent, capable woman is slowly convinced by the people around her that she is less than what she actually is, and what happens when she finally decides. She has had enough of the convincing. Because while Carol was rearranging her centerpieces and Melissa was making comments about Rachel sitting at home all day, Rachel was not sitting at home doing nothing. She had started a business. Quietly, deliberately and entirely on her own. Using the business degree she had almost traded away for a promotion she never took, Rachel had launched a small digital content and branding consultancy from the second bedroom of their house in Columbus. She had one client in the first month, three by the third month. By the end of her first year, she had 11 ongoing clients and was generating more monthly income than she ever had at the Atlanta marketing firm. But here is the part that should make you stop and think. Nobody in that house knew. Not Carol, not Melissa, not Gerald. The only person who knew was Daniel, and Daniel said nothing. Why would a husband stay silent about something like that? That is the question that will follow this story all the way to its most painful moment. Daniel knew. He had seen the invoices. He had watched her build her client list. He had been there on the evening she landed her biggest contract, a 3-year retainer with a regional retail brand out of Cincinnati. And he had hugged her in the kitchen and said, "That's incredible, babe. I'm so proud of you." And then the next morning, when his mother called and asked why Rachel wasn't looking for real work, Daniel said, "She's figuring things out." He said that for 2 years. She's figuring things out. As if the woman quietly depositing $4,000 a month into their joint savings account was still searching for a direction. As if the woman who had just paid off their second car loan without saying a word was still wandering. Rachel heard him say it once. She was standing at the top of the stairs, and she heard his voice come up from the living room below. "She's figuring things out, Mom. Give her time." She stood there for a long moment. Then she walked back to her office, sat down, and opened her laptop. She did not bring it up that night. She told herself it wasn't worth the argument. She would tell herself that for 2 more years. The daily texture of life in that house is something that is hard to describe unless you have lived it. It was not loud. It was not violent. It was something quieter and in many ways more exhausting. It was the slow, steady erosion of dignity that comes from being dismissed every single day by people who are supposed to love you. Carol would come over and ask Rachel what she had done that day. Not warmly, not curiously, more like a principal asking a student to account for unexcused absences. Rachel would say she had been working. Carol would look at her with a tight, polite smile and say something like, "Oh, your little project? That's sweet." And then she would turn to Daniel and ask if he wanted her to send over her pot roast recipe, as if the real cooking in that house could only be trusted to the women who had come before Rachel. Melissa was worse in a different way. Melissa would come over for Sunday dinners and sit at the table talking about her work week, her patients, her schedule, her long hours, and every few sentences she would angle just slightly toward Rachel and say things like, "I don't know how you do it, staying home all day." I would go crazy. And everyone at the table would laugh softly, and Daniel would laugh too, and Rachel would sit there with her fork in her hand and say nothing. Think about that for a second. Can you imagine sitting at your own dinner table, in your own home, while the people around you laugh at a version of you that does not even exist? Can you imagine the discipline it takes to stay quiet when every part of you wants to stand up and say, you have no idea who you are sitting across from? By the second year of marriage, Rachel had developed a kind of internal routine for surviving those family dinners. She would make the food, always made the food, because if she didn't, Carol would offer to bring something and then spend the whole evening explaining what she had brought and how she had made it. She would set the table. She would smile when spoken to. She would redirect conversations that were heading somewhere painful. And when dinner was over and the family had gone home, she would sit in the bathroom with the door locked and the faucet running, just to have 5 minutes of silence that belonged entirely to her. Daniel would knock eventually. "You okay in there?" And she would say yes. Because what else do you say to a man who watched everything that happened at that table and chose, again and again, to look the other way? What words are big enough for that? Rachel did not have them yet, but they were coming. Slowly, quietly, the way everything important in her life had always come, they were coming. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being misunderstood by the people who are supposed to know you best. Rachel had lived with that loneliness for 2 years when the situation took a turn she had not anticipated. It started with money. Not her money specifically, but a conversation about money that happened at a family barbecue in July of what would turn out to be the last summer Rachel spent inside that family structure. Daniel's cousin, Marcus, had come in from out of town with his wife, and somewhere between the potato salad and the second round of drinks, the conversation turned to finances. Marcus mentioned that he and his wife were looking at investment properties. Daniel talked about his retirement contributions. Gerald mentioned something about the value of his pension. And then Carol, with the particular kind of casual cruelty that had become her specialty, looked at Rachel across the picnic table and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, Rachel isn't exactly helping on that front. But Daniel's doing well enough to carry the both of them. God bless him." There was laughter. There was the kind of laughter that is not really laughter. It is agreement dressed in sound. And Rachel looked at Daniel. She looked at him directly, the way she had 100 times before. And Daniel picked up his drink, looked out across the yard, and said nothing. If you're still watching, drop a comment right now and say, "I'm still here." Because what happened next is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Rachel drove home alone that evening. Daniel stayed behind to help clean up, or so he said. She pulled into the driveway, sat in the car for 11 minutes, and made a decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not the kind that involves slamming doors or throwing things. A quiet decision. The kind that is made after years of evidence have finally accumulated into something undeniable. She went inside, walked past the living room, past the kitchen, straight to her home office. She opened her laptop. She opened her accounting software. And she printed 2 documents. The first was a 12-month income summary. The second was a record of every household expense she had covered either partially or in full over the prior 18 months. The second car payment, 14 months of grocery bills she had quietly absorbed, the new water heater in December, a portion of their property taxes in April. She paper-clipped the 2 documents together, placed them on the kitchen counter, and went to bed. She slept better that night than she had in months. Not because the problem was solved, but because she had finally stopped pretending it wasn't one. 3 weeks passed. Rachel did not bring up the documents. She waited. She went about her days, client calls in the morning, project work in the afternoon, dinner in the evening, and she waited to see if Daniel would say anything. He did not. The papers sat on his nightstand now, where she had moved them the morning after she printed them, because she wanted him to have seen them clearly, privately, without an audience. He never mentioned them. He never thanked her. He never said, "I should have said something. I should have told them." Nothing. Just the same quiet that had become the defining sound of their marriage. And in that silence, Rachel's clarity sharpened. She began calling her attorney, not to file anything yet, but to understand her options. She began separating her finances incrementally, carefully. She opened a personal account at a different bank. She updated her business registration. She contacted 2 of her longest-standing clients and quietly confirmed her contract terms. She was not angry. She was methodical. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what makes Rachel Monroe's story so remarkable. She did not explode. She prepared. 6 months after the barbecue in July, there was a Christmas gathering at Carol and Gerald's house. It was the last one Rachel would attend as Daniel's wife, though she did not announce that going in. She arrived composed, dressed well, carrying a dish she had made herself, a baked brie with honey and walnuts that Carol immediately moved to the back of the counter to make room for her own centerpiece. The evening progressed the way those evenings always did. Carol held court in the kitchen. Gerald watched football. Melissa talked about her year at work, and twice found ways to insert small comments about how lucky Rachel was to have so much free time. And then, after dinner, while the dishes were being cleared, Carol made a toast. She stood at the head of the table, raised her glass, and began talking about the family, how proud she was of Daniel, how well he was doing, how much he had grown into a provider and a man of character. She talked for several minutes. She did not mention Rachel once. Not by name. Not by implication. Not even obliquely. Rachel was sitting at that table, and she was erased from the toast entirely. That was the moment. Not the barbecue. Not the years of she's figuring things out. This was the moment. Being made invisible at a family table she had helped set, in a house where she had spent years trying to be enough. She set down her glass. She looked at Daniel. He was looking at his mother, smiling. And in that moment, Rachel understood something she had perhaps known for a long time, but had refused to accept. Daniel was never going to choose her. Not because he was a monster, but because choosing her would have required him to disappoint them, and he had never once in his life been willing to do that. The room was still warm and laughing when Rachel reached into her bag, placed 2 folded sheets of paper on the table in front of Daniel. copies of the same income and expense documents she had left on his nightstand 6 months before, and said, calmly, clearly, and without a raised voice, "Before this family continues to discuss what I do and don't contribute, I think you should read those." Then she stood up, thanked Carol for dinner, picked up her coat, and left. She told me later, in the account she later shared publicly in a written piece that circulated widely on a personal finance and relationships platform, that she sat in her car outside for a few minutes before driving away. She said she did not cry. She said she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt like herself. The documents she had left on the table detailed over $62,000 in personal income over the previous 18 months and over $19,000 in household expenses she had covered independently. In the days that followed, there were phone calls. There were messages from Melissa that swung between defensive and apologetic. There was one voicemail from Carol that Rachel saved, not out of bitterness, but because Carol's voice on that message was different, smaller. The certainty was gone. And there was Daniel. Daniel came home that night and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before he spoke. He said, "I should have said something. 3 years too late," but he said it. And Rachel, who had waited years to hear it, found that by the time it finally came, it no longer changed anything. Hear that for what it is. It is not a story about a bad man. Daniel was not a villain. He was something in some ways harder to understand. He was a man who loved his wife genuinely, but loved his comfort more. He had grown up in a family where his mother's approval was the currency of peace, and he had never stopped spending it, even when the cost was someone else's dignity. That is a quiet kind of failure. Not dramatic, not deliberate, but real and consequential, and the kind of thing that hollows a marriage out from the inside, while everything on the outside still looks fine at the holidays. Rachel filed for divorce in February of the following year. The process was not contentious. There were no children. The finances were straightforward, more straightforward, in fact, than anyone in that family had expected, because Rachel had documented everything meticulously. She moved back to Georgia in the spring. She took her business, her savings, and the version of herself she had spent 3 years quietly fighting to protect. Now here is what happened after. And this is the part of Rachel's story that deserves to be heard just as loudly as everything that came before. Because this is not a story that ends in damage. In Georgia, Rachel reconnected with a college friend named Diane who had started a small business accelerator for women entrepreneurs in the Atlanta area. Diane had heard pieces of Rachel's story and invited her to speak at one of their quarterly events, not about her divorce, but about her business, about what she had built quietly in a back bedroom while the people around her assumed she was doing nothing. Rachel stood in front of 47 women that Saturday morning in a rented event space off Peachtree Road. And she told the truth. She told them how she had built a 6-figure consulting business in a house where nobody believed in her. She told them how she had learned to keep records, to protect herself financially, to build quietly when there was no room to build loudly. She told them that the loneliest period of her life had, paradoxically, produced the strongest version of herself. Because when no one is watching, when no one is cheering, when no one is even acknowledging that you're working, and you keep going anyway, you discover something about yourself that comfort could never have taught you. The response to that speech was something Rachel had not prepared for. Women in the room were crying. Not sad crying, the kind of crying that happens when something true lands somewhere deep. Several of them came to her afterward and said variations of the same thing. "I didn't know someone else had lived in my house." That is the part of this story that I want you to sit with for a moment. Because Rachel's story is specific, her name, her family, her house in Columbus. But the experience she describes is not rare. The experience of being in a space where your contributions are invisible, where your silence is mistaken for weakness, where the person who is supposed to stand beside you stands beside everyone else instead. That experience is not rare. And the courage it takes to document your worth, to stop asking for validation from people who have decided not to give it, and to walk out of a room without screaming, that is not a small courage. That is enormous. And it is the kind of courage that rarely gets acknowledged, because it does not look like courage from the outside. It looks like someone quietly picking up her coat. 2 years after leaving Ohio, Rachel Monroe's consultancy had grown to a team of 4. She had moved into a small office space in Decatur. She had signed a publishing deal for a short business guide targeted at women running home-based businesses who needed frameworks for financial self-protection. The foreword was written by Diane. The title was simple. It was 6 words. It said, "They saw nothing. She built everything." When the book was released, Rachel did one interview, a long-form conversation for an independent podcast focused on women and entrepreneurship. The host asked her what she would say to the version of herself standing at that kitchen sink at 5 in the morning, hands in cold dishwater, feeling invisible. Rachel thought about it for a moment, and then she said, "I would tell her that she already knows. She already knows what she's worth. She just needs to stop waiting for the room to agree." And here is the final thing this story asks of you. Not from Rachel, from the story itself. Because stories like this one do not survive in silence. They survive because someone decides they are worth telling. So think about this. How many people in your life are being quietly dismissed right now? How many people around you are building something real in spaces where no one is paying attention and carrying the weight of that invisibility every single day without complaint? And what would it cost you? Truly, what would it cost you to look at one of those people and say out loud, "I see what you're doing, and it matters"? That is not a small thing. Rachel Monroe would tell you that. The absence of those 6 words, spoken by one specific person at one specific table for years at a time, was the thing that changed the entire shape of her life. Not dramatically, not all at once, but permanently. Words of acknowledgement are not soft gestures. They are structural. They hold people up or they let them fall. And once in a while, the most important thing you can do for someone is simply refuse to be silent when silence would have been easier. What would you have done? If you had been sitting at that table, if you had watched years of quiet contribution go unacknowledged, if you had handed someone the evidence of your worth and waited 6 months without hearing a word, what would you have done? Would you have stayed? Would you have spoken sooner? Would you have held on longer, hoping the silence would eventually become something different? There is no wrong answer. Because the truth is, most of us have been in a version of that room. Most of us have looked across a table or across a relationship at someone who was supposed to see us and felt the particular weight of being unseen. And what Rachel's story reminds us is that the people who survive that experience are not the ones who harden. They are the ones who eventually, quietly, choose themselves. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Drop a comment below and tell us, what was the moment in this story that hit you hardest? Was it the silence at the table? The documents on the nightstand? Or that final sentence from her speech? "She just needs to stop waiting for the room to agree"? We read every single comment, and your responses matter here. And if you thought this story was something, if it moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of someone you know, wait until you see the next one. Because the stories we bring to this channel are not fiction. They are drawn from real accounts, real lives, real moments where ordinary people were pushed to extraordinary limits. And what they did next changed everything. Subscribe so you never miss them. Because some stories need to be heard, and some truths need a witness. Thank you for being one today.